Okay, class, this should be Thursday, day 4 of our Civil Rights Unit. This is my second attempt. It is unique to record these. These get released a day earlier on YouTube. No reason to get ahead. I will release them the day that I would expect you to, sometime throughout that day, learn about them through Google Classroom. So today we're going to do a little bit of review and then a little bit of notes. Just your last reminder that if you're in honors, your document of the week is due by the start of your normally scheduled class. And if you're in first, fourth, sixth, or seventh, your makeup document of the week is due by the start of your class. And these are time stamped, and I won't be accepting them after that. So please make sure you get those in. But let's start off with a little bit of review after we look at our objectives. We've already covered the new strategy, that is to use the judicial branch. We've covered Brown versus Board and Plessy versus Ferguson. We've covered why passive resistance or civil disobedience is so important because it creates empathy for the cause and highlights the violence of the oppressor. Today, we're going to start on this impact of the Freedom Riders and the March on Washington. We're not going to get to the March on Washington today, but we will get to the Freedom Riders. But before we get to that, let's do a little bit of review. I'll make this a little bit quicker. You guys did great on these first 3 questions. Most of you did okay on number 4, but there were a few of you who got a little confused. Uh, what do you call nonviolent resistance to unfair laws? It's called civil disobedience or passive resistance. I will accept either. I prefer civil disobedience. And it's so effective because it creates empathy for the cause or highlights the violence of the oppressor. I had about a dozen of you write, what do you call nonviolent resistance to unfair laws? And you wrote sit in. A sit in is an example of civil disobedience. It is not the definition of civil disobedience, if that makes sense. So you want to make sure you're using the term civil disobedience for the overall answer. Then if I say, hey, can you give me an example of civil disobedience? You could say, oh, a peaceful march, oh, a sit-in. Those are examples of that. Along the line of review, let's take a look real quick at your worksheet that you did yesterday. So some of you might have noticed that it kicked back a response to you or a grade to you. I think I have that fixed now, but even if it did, that is not your real grade because it is going to kick back something that is not entirely accurate because I'm going to manually grade these. So, for example, for this first question, it says a protest in which people refuse service and exert economic pressure. Well, that's a boycott. When I made the key, I might have capitalized it, I might not have. And if you did the opposite, it will mark you wrong. That's why any of these that you have to write something in, I'm going to manually grade that. The only thing that gets auto graded are those check boxes down below. But anything with an actual typed in response, no matter what the program tells you, I'm going to grade it manually before I put it anywhere. And then I'm going to try to make sure it's in Google Classroom, your grade, but absolutely will be in Progress Book accurately. If you ever see it in Progress Book and you think it's unfair, then you contact me right away and we'll sort that out. Okay, so what do we call nonviolent resistance to unfair laws? Well, we keep hitting this point, civil disobedience. Dr. King wanted to expand his success in Montgomery, Alabama by creating this network of volunteers and churches. What did they create? Well, that's the SCLC, or Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So I had some people write it out, some people didn't, and it marked some of those wrong. Again, I'm grading it by hand. You're going to get credit for that. The philosophical basis of how Dr. King was promoting the fight against injustice was inspired to some degree by what world leader slash activist? Well, that's Gandhi. Some got fancy and wrote Mahatma Gandhi, which is technically his first name. That's absolutely correct. But again, it might have marked it wrong. I will make sure you get credit for it. And although it can be traced back here and there throughout history, college students made this form of protest incredibly popular and effective throughout the 60s. That's a sit-in. The sit-in is what those North Carolina college students popularized as a form of civil disobedience. And then finally, this was pretty easy. You could see this hopefully a little bit better than this, but well, maybe you couldn't. No, you could in yours. I think I'm looking at the key or the teacher version. But Dr. King was the unofficial but almost universally recognized spokesman for the party or for the civil rights movement. Ezell Blair Jr. was one of the 4 students from North Carolina. Thurgood Marshall, lawyer and future Supreme Court Justice, Plessy versus Ferguson, the bad court case from 1896, and Brown versus Board, the court case from 1954. there's a little bit of a review. We're starting on the third section now. I have mentioned in the notes a few times about the timeline. I guess I could plop that in there real quick. I think this is pretty self-explanatory to you. 1896, again, Plessy versus Ferguson. 54, Brown versus Board. 1955, Montgomery bus boycott. 1957, the Little Rock Nine. If this kind of puts it all into perspective of when did all of this come down, SCLC in 1957, and sit-ins start throughout the South. So we're through that much. We have this much to go before we are done with this particular unit. So, nope, that's not what I wanted you to do at all. Let's see if we can find the right section. Nope. This is what happens sometimes when you are teaching in a different format. These are all notes you'll eventually see. How about this page? Maybe, hopefully. There we go. This is section 3, the government's response. So we have focused on what the civil rights movement has been doing. We're going to focus on how the government responded to this. And we're going to start by talking about the 1960 presidential election. Again, the only note you have to take, other than the heading, so far is John F. Kennedy won the 1960 election. So John F. Kennedy, this gentleman, was running against Richard Nixon, who had been the vice president for Eisenhower from 52 to 60. And JFK won in a very, very close race. His running mate, in other words, his vice presidential candidate, was this guy, Lyndon Johnson, who we've already covered the Vietnam War, so you know that he's the one really conducting a big chunk of the Vietnam War. But in 1960, these two men were in a very close race, JFK and Nixon. And a lot of people will tell you that what really helped JFK get over the top is that they had the nation's first televised presidential debate. And people who listened to that debate on the radio, basically, I think it was 65% said Nixon won. But people who watched it on TV said JFK won at about the same rate, at about 65%. So there were some hardcore supporters on both sides who didn't care how they saw it. They saw their guy as winning. But for those in-between voters, why would they have thought that JFK won the TV version when he didn't win the radio version? Well, a lot of sociological studies will tell you that we have a tendency to believe good-looking people. And JFK was considered by his contemporaries to be a very handsome president. And Richard Nixon wasn't. It doesn't help the fact that Nixon refused to wear makeup because he didn't understand that on TV, and any of you who have ever done any theater know this, the lights are so bright, it kind of flushes you out. So he looked really, really pale. Plus, he had just been getting over the flu. JFK was tanning in Miami and also wore makeup. So he simply looked like a better version of himself as well. And so a lot of people will tell you this is when we start to see there's a lot of style, sometimes unfortunately over substance, when it comes to politics at every level. And this is one of those points that shows this. But regardless, JFK wins in a very close race. He has as his running mate one of those few Southern congressmen, Lyndon Johnson, who was for civil rights. So how does this play out for civil rights leaders? Well, JFK was the preferred candidate of most people who believed in civil rights. However, JFK wasn't like openly in favor of civil rights. He gave a lot of hints, a lot of subtle indications. Meeting with Dr. King, shaking hands, and having conferences with him. That's a strong indicator that they must have something positive to talk about. Where Nixon didn't do that, but JFK is a politician who's trying to balance the idea that millions of, in some cases, newly registered African American voters obviously want him to be in favor of civil rights, but many Southerners don't want him moving too fast on civil rights, and unfortunately, many of them think anything is too fast. And so he is trying to balance things. He is trying to play sort of both sides of this, and it works enough to get him elected, but almost immediately starts failing him because civil rights leaders are like, okay, are you going to do something? And Southerners are like, whoa, hold on, you're not going to do something, are you? It's a real pickle to be in. And so civil rights leaders demand he does more, Southerners demand he do less, and he has to choose a side. Eventually, it's going to be one of his closest advisors, who's also his younger brother, the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy. Everybody called him Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy is going to be who pushes the issue because of a group of people called Freedom Riders. So we've already discussed the concept of the sit-in. What's key with the sit-in is that you're testing a particular facility, say a restaurant, to see whether or not they are allowing black and white customers to sit together, if they're truly desegregated, whether they said they were or not. And so ideally, you need both white and black volunteers to go in together. In many cases, in many communities, you had a hard time getting volunteers, not because people didn't believe in it, but just think of that small town mentality of if person X is the person who pushes the issue, even if they win that day, unfortunately, people can make life very, very difficult on that individual well beyond that day. They might know where they live. They might know their boss. They might get them fired. They might know where they live and do terrible things to their home or to them personally. Freedom Riders they're really from all over, but a lot of times they're northern civil rights activists, black and white, who are willing to, and a lot of times, by the way, they're students, college students on summer vacation, willing to ride a Greyhound bus down to southern cities, communities, and just simply all get off buses together at various stops, black and white together, and sit down and order a cup of coffee. And the ideal situation is you order a cup of coffee and they serve you and you leave. And it's a victory. You know that place is integrated. Nobody made a big deal out of it. If, however, you were refused service, it is essentially a mobile sit-in, if that makes sense. You have a bunch of people who are going to say, we have money. We're here to purchase lunch or dinner or whatever it might be. And if we're not going to be served, then we're not leaving. And then they would, from there, follow those strategies of creating empathy for the cause and highlighting the violence of the oppressor by not fighting back, by conducting essentially a sit-in. Well, these bus passengers were testing this throughout the South, and the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, wanted to make sure they were protected. Because, ladies and gentlemen, although what they're doing is incredibly noble and peaceful, not everybody responded in kind. So a common strategy of racists in the South would be to have a police officer pull over this bus that was known to be a Freedom Rider bus. And they would make up whatever excuse, taillights out or whatever, and they wouldn't say anything. They'd say, okay, you have a warning. But what they then did was essentially have that bus be pulled over. The cop drives away, but then a truckload of local, I don't know how else to word it, white supremacists shows up and throws in a Molotov cocktail into the bus or starts attacking passengers of the bus. This is the sort of battleground that the civil rights movement had moved to at that point. So Freedom Riders are pushing the issue. Bobby Kennedy, very much a friend of civil rights, had one of his own personal aides beat nearly to death in one of these attacks on Freedom Riders. Well, we don't want to do that. How about that? There we go. So Bobby Kennedy said, you know what, as the Attorney General, that's sort of like the top cop, I'm going to make it the job of the government to help minorities register to vote. Because in many communities, many states like Mississippi, only 5% of African Americans were actually registered to vote. So he is going to take over those local communities who were doing all those things we've discussed in other chapters like literacy testing, grandfather clause, all these Jim Crow style laws that are designed to oppress the right to vote from African Americans. He is going to use the federal government's resources to help ensure that people get the right to vote who are, of the appropriate age. So the SCLC and other groups start to use churches as the place where people could register to vote. That's when you start to see white supremacists bombing churches, leading to many deaths throughout the country, but I think most notably for, I think they were all 8 or under, but 4 girls who were practicing for their church choir on one particular Sunday who died in a bombing. And so, even though the civil rights movement is incredibly peaceful and is still very seriously, rigorously following um, civil disobedience, it's not stopping outsiders, racists, from having violent attacks upon them. And so JFK is still sort of reluctant to himself do anything. He's trying to stay out of this. He doesn't want to upset African Americans too much by not doing nothing and lose their vote in the next election, but he doesn't want to upset Southerners by doing too much. And so he's just sort of straddling this fence. And it's his brother, Bobby Kennedy, who says, "Hey, I got news for you. You're going to lose if you don't do something. You're either going to lose the African American vote because you just pretended to be for civil rights, or you're going to lose the Southern vote because you're doing too much. So it looks like you're going to lose when you run for reelection. So why don't you at least go out doing the right thing?" And Bobby Kennedy, again, was very clearly in favor of supporting civil rights. He knew that to be the right thing. And so you're going to slowly see JFK come around and go, all right, there's a pretty good chance I can't win in 1964 anyway. I might as well be on the right side of history for this. It's events then in Birmingham, Alabama, that are going to bring JFK and Dr. King and the civil rights movement and really a lot of just quote unquote average Americans together on this issue. Birmingham, Alabama was identified by Dr. King as the most racist city, Dr. King's advisors, as the most racist city in the South. That is a dubious dishonor. And what a lot of advisors would basically say to you is then, hey, Dr. King, Birmingham, Alabama's the worst. We got to avoid this. But in the mind of Dr. King, it's like, oh, Birmingham, Alabama's the worst. That's where we've got to go. And so this city was so racist that in order to not desegregate, they simply closed all of their businesses. We're talking about grocery stores. We're talking about schools. We're talking about diners. We're talking about virtually everything is closed because they would rather be closed than integrated and equal. You got to wrap your head around that notion. So they're so racist, they're willing to drive to other communities to shop, to worship, to do whatever. And so Dr. King shows up and he focuses his peaceful protest there. Now, of course, he was jailed. And I say, of course, with dripping with sarcasm, but the idea of that, peaceful protest, fighting for what's right. How do you deal with that when you're a racist? Well, I guess you throw him in jail. In theory, the actual reason he's in jail is because he doesn't have permits to have a particular march. I don't want to get into this too much, but essentially, if you want to have a march or a protest, the community, most communities will say you have to have some sort of permit. And there are logical reasons to not allow them. So, for example, if you wanted to have a protest on the 4th of July, that might not work out because the community might already have a parade scheduled for that day, whatever. But you have to be reasonable. You have to say, okay, well, you have these open dates or whatever it is. Dr. King wasn't allowed to have any dates. Every date they had some made up excuse of why they couldn't do it. So at some point, he just said, oh, we're going to protest anyway because you're never going to give the permits. And when he is doing these protests, he then gets thrown in jail. Now, because he's in a Birmingham jail, you ready for your mind to be blown here? He writes the very not confusing title of a book called, well, really, it's a novella, Letters. I think it's Letters. No, it is Letter from a Birmingham Jail, in which he basically is writing to the world. Here's why civil disobedience works. Because remember, not the whole world didn't get to be in SNCC or SCLC training. So he's explaining how civil disobedience works, why he's willing to sit in jail when he hasn't committed a crime, why he will always peacefully resist these injustices. And this letter from a Birmingham jail ends up becoming very popular. And a lot of people who, before that, I think thought this wasn't their problem. They may have had empathy for Dr. King, but said, well, that's his problem. That's that group's problem. And people start to perceive it as America's problem. Is a very famous line in there because people were always telling Dr. King, well, don't move too fast. Well, remember, slavery had ended in 1866. Nobody's moving too fast. And I don't know if it's ever too fast to have equality and things done right. But he just delivers this line that justice too long delayed is justice denied. I think that hits home with a lot of people. So, how does Birmingham respond to that? Uh, Violently. There's no logic to it. The police attack the protesters who are trying to protest not only the horrible segregation in Birmingham, but the treatment of Dr. King. And the police use things such as snarling dogs, whoops, water hoses, and police beatings. And again, I showed you some pictures of civil disobedience yesterday. A lot of those pictures were from Birmingham. And this then gets covered by the TV news. And for the same reason that Vietnam was in a lot of people's living rooms, you start to have the development of satellite TV. So something that happens in Birmingham is seen on the 6 o'clock news all throughout the country. And when Americans see their fellow citizens being attacked by dogs, being knocked down 20 feet and having arms broken by water hoses, being beat by the police when they are not fighting back. Because remember, you don't fight back, and that way it can't be reframed. You don't just show part of the incident to make one side look bad. There's no video you could show of this to make anybody look bad but Birmingham. And so Americans, by and large, start to feel more empathy and start to be more outraged by the violence they see in Birmingham. Finally, John F. Kennedy addresses the nation and says, okay, clearly all Americans can see what is going on in Birmingham and throughout the South is a shame. And so he gets behind a strong civil rights bill and a plan to end segregation in the few remaining footholds that it had. JFK finally is just going to put all of his chips on one side of this. And again, had he lived, which you'll find out about later on, this might have cost him the election, but I don't know that he was going to get reelected anyway. So he might as well be on the right side of history. That is enough for today. I've kind of hit you with a lot there. I am going to have a video for you available. It is entirely optional. And I know that a lot of you won't do anything that's optional. I get it. But I will tell you that the video Voices is incredibly moving and significant, pertinent. It's a little different than most of the things you've seen. It is a series of interviews with people who lived through the civil rights movement who are not famous. They do not interview Dr. King or Rosa Parks or Malcolm X or anybody famous at all. They're interviewing everyday regular people and they're just telling their stories. Now, the video was probably made about 10 years ago. And so most of them are, in their 50s and 60s, and they're just telling you things that were in their life experiences. I will warn you that there's some language because a lot of the victims of some of the racism they encountered, they're explaining to you the terms and the words that people shouted and screamed at them. They're talking about the incidents they experienced. But I assure you it is worth your time. And maybe if you have time, watch 10 minutes of it today and 10 minutes of another time. It is moving to think that people who are probably about the age of your grandparents have it within their life experiences to have these just insanely open racist things happen to them. And again, I'm not naive enough to think that racist things don't still happen, but the examples that this generation have of just open policy, of it just being like, oh, that's how it is, or nobody's even trying to hide it. It's just mind numbing. And so if you get a chance, watch that. Again, there's some language issues. I wouldn't watch that with little brothers or sisters around. And you make sure your parents are okay with it. But it is well worth your time. So Stay safe. Tomorrow will be a little bit more low key. We've got Dumb Laws, Dumb Crooks. And then I will set up what will probably now happen on Monday, the assassination of JFK. Even if we start talking about it tomorrow, the silly video reenactment that I will construct of it will be more likely on Monday. All right, stay safe out there and get those makeup documents of the week in.